We're now going to start covering a period that is technically the end of the Renaissance or late Renaissance, but is typically called mannerism to set it apart from the two earlier periods of the Renaissance. Mannerism begins in the 15 teens and will be the primary style until close to 1600. And it's a style that is very different from earlier Mannerist styles. And the main way in which it differs is that it is no longer wedded to mimesis. In the absence of focusing on mimesis, what we'll find in Mannerism is an emphasis on style. So rather than focus on just recreating how the world looks, individual artists will develop specific signature styles. And in order to have a signature style, you can't just recreate what the world looks like, because then it's not recognizable as a style. The style is how it deviates from a mimetic representation. The term mannerism has often been used to explain that this is a period that is very much about these individual styles, because the root of mannerism is probably of one of two words. One, manera, or manner, and if you think about mannerisms, I know that people can often identify my family members because our mannerisms are so similar. And even if we didn't look a lot alike, they could still identify us as related just because of the way we respond or act or move or say certain things. And that's our manner. It's just something that is unique to us. So a manner can be a style. The other possible root word is manos, or hand. And when one talks about the hand of an artist, they are talking about the style in which that artist often painted. I want to go on a brief aside to talk about why all these individual styles. And we can't give a very specific reason, but what we can do is talk about a possible reason for this rejection of mimesis. The period starting in the 1510s and running to 1600 was a period in which European minds were blown. They were encountering so much that was new and different. For instance, they were aware that there was this whole other world that they knew nothing about. And in that world, people did not follow the same religion. They didn't have the same kind of political systems. They didn't even have the same kind of food, which always baffles me, because I think about those Italians. I know tomatoes come from the New World. What were those Italians eating before tomatoes came to Italy? I don't know. But their minds were blown, and in fact we know that once they start to trade and have regular contact with the Americas, people will come down to the ports and just watch what's coming off ships because it's so mind-boggling to them. Another thing that changes very, very radically is religion in Europe. So chugging along from about 600 to 1517, you were a Moor in Spain, who eventually got ousted from Spain, or were considered a complete outsider. You could be a Jew, in which case you lived according to a completely different set of rules, had a lot of restrictions, were forced to live in parts of towns called ghettos that had curfews. And these were not necessarily lower income areas, they were just where the Jews lived. And if anything really crappy happened in town, like say the Black Plague broke out, they'd blame you for it and a lot of you would get killed. Okay. Or you were Catholic. In the 11th century, there was a split between the Catholic Church in Rome and the Catholic Church in Eastern Europe, but the Eastern European stuff was concentrated in areas that were not in terribly close contact with Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Scandinavia, and England, which is most of what we cover in this class. So basically, you were Catholic. And it wasn't until 1517 that there was a clear break between the Catholic Church and people who were Christian but did not want to be Catholic. That all changed in 1517 when Martin Luther pinned the 95 Theses on the doors of the Wittenberg Cathedral, which might be a little bit legendary, but basically there was a strong indication that mainly Germans were going to break with the Catholic Church in 1517, and Martin Luther had a lot to do with it. I just couldn't resist putting this new Playmobil, which has been released on the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, in the slideshow. It was the fastest selling Playmobil figure of all time, and it sold out. I think there were 72,000 that were sold out in 3 days or something. But regardless, you have, for the first time, a break between the Catholic and Protestant churches in Europe that commences during the Mannerist period, and they have an inkling of this beforehand. They have an inkling that their ideas are being challenged, and they address that in the High Renaissance. But in Mannerism, it's almost like people are like, oh, that nothing is definitive anymore. There's these Americas, we know more about Africa and Asia, and the world is so different than we thought it was, and on top of that, we can't even rely on the church that we have known for so long. There might be some options to that. And it's not surprising to me that they turn to this more fantastic style. We have inklings of this style in the paintings by Michelangelo in the Sistine ceiling, particularly in that serpent's tail. And you look at that and you see that serpent's tail it's almost opalescent, where if you look from different angles at something, it'll change colors. Sharkskin fabric is also opalescent. And you have this fantastic green and peach combination that is not like the real world. And the fact that he used these stunning colors really gives you a sense of how he was developing his style. But also, look at those people. Oh my God, those people are buff. Eve is super buff. And that was his style that he developed, to have these incredibly powerful looking muscles on the figures in his work. And by the way, when I say Eve is buff, I mean Eve before the fall. After the fall, they're supposed to be all ugly and icky, so concentrate on the before the fall. Okay. So he's got a bit of that style going on as well, moving away from mimesis. But I think one of the best people to look at for this idea of a very distinctive style is Pontormo. And I'm going to use him to sum up two things that are going on in Mannerism. One, this idea of distinctive styles. And two, some special concerns of Catholic art during this period. We will be addressing Protestant art when we look at Northern Europe, but that's a few lectures from now. So, Pontormo was a Florentine artist, and he, if you look at this painting, you'll notice that all the people kind of look the same. I've already addressed that in Leonardo's work and Michelangelo's work, but Leonardo and Michelangelo's people, they look kind of like people. There's some distortions going on in Pontormo that are not naturalistic, and they aren't even idealized people. if you look at the people as he paints them, they have these elongated bodies, they have these oval-shaped heads, and all their features are kind of squashed in. Their features all tend to be the same, so this supposed portrait looks just like Mary, who looks like Christ, who looks like the guy who's carrying Christ, looks like the people who are mourning Christ, and even the little figure in the black hat behind Mary, that guy's Pontormo, the artist, and he has the same features, so everyone's more or less shown the same way. They tend to have a kind of distorted body type, and the facial features are squashed into their face and seem a little sort of squished down. So here we have a distinctive style. Another thing that is pretty distinctive about Pontormo's style is the colors that he uses. He tends to use a fair amount of cornflower blues. He uses an orangish red called light cadmium. And you can see that on the trousers of the halberdier, and also on the cloaks of some of the figures behind you. You see the cornflower blue on lots of the clothes in the images. He has a kind of acidic pink that he uses for some of the garments, as well as one of the figures' backs. And he also tends to use a lot of olive green. You can see that around Christ's waist, but not much in the other parts of this picture. In fact, the colors are so distinctive, and these distortions of the figure are so distinctive, that I ended up applying them to come up with the name of one of my pets. So about 20 years ago, I adopted this crazy-looking cat from the pound, and I named him Pontormo. And I named him Pontormo because he had one cornflower blue eye, he had an olive green eye, he had a pink nose, and his facial features were kind of small on his big head. He had a huge head. And then he had kind of narrow shoulders and a wide butt. And I was like, man, that's a Pontormo. And I remember going to a museum with my dad, and he looked at this painting and goes, oh, that painting kind of reminds me of your cat, who we called Sal because no one could remember Pontormo. But it reminds me of your cat Sal. And I'm like, well, actually, that's a Pontormo, and that's the cat's name, so it's a Pontormo. If you can recognize a cat based on some weird art historian's naming of her pet, based on stylistic characteristics of the painter, that's a very unique style. But we can go beyond sort of the distortions in style and talk about a few other things that are going on with this work. The painting was made for Santa Felicita, which is in Florence. It's in the Ultra Arno, if you're familiar with Florence. And it is not in the front of the church. When you walk up to the church, you don't see it. It is as you're walking out of the church in a kind of alcove to the side. And what's significant about this is that the way a Catholic Mass takes, the way it's scheduled is that very close to the end is the sacrifice, or the sacrament of the Eucharist, where the wafer and the wine are transubstantiated into the body and blood of God, and then Christ, and then you partake in that in remembrance of Him, and that's supposed to bestow you with grace. So imagine as you are walking out of the church and you look to the side, what you'll see. And that is this, and you are actually looking up at a very particular angle. As you look up at the painting, while you're walking out, you are looking up at the face of the dead Christ. If He could open His eyes, they would open and look at you. Keep in mind that according to Catholic theology, you have just eaten His body and blood, for which He had to die so that you could have grace and go to heaven. So, you can walk out as my mom would say, with an attitude of gratitude, or you can walk out feeling pretty guilty, depending how well emotionally adjusted you are. But so you are making this direct connection to Christ who sacrificed himself for you. And in case you missed the direct engagement of Christ's eyes, there are a lot of other people who will engage your eyes, who are looking out at you, drawing you into that painting. And this is because Mannerist art is also starting to consider the viewer involvement. You can look at Leonardo's Last Supper and completely get it in about 30 seconds. You can look at Michelangelo's work and understand it very quickly. They were going for clarity. If you look at mimetic works, you might not see everything immediately, but you sort of get the main point. But with Mannerist work, what they wanted to do was involve the viewer. And they'll try to involve you either emotionally or intellectually. For Pontormo, it's emotionally. And one more point about his style here that also helps to involve you. Pontormo did not use linear perspective. Things are not getting smaller at a regular rate. If I asked the class to try to set up the scene again, you would need some of those pulleys that they use in Broadway shows and stuff to make people fly around, right? Maybe some bleachers, but those bleachers would have to have those steps really close to each other to layer people upwards like this. So he's not using linear perspective, and in doing so, what he does is he forces the figures who are in the back closer to us. They feel physically closer. And that's not uncommon in Mannerist art, to try to really engage the viewer like this.